Hello, my dear friends. You are standing in a field of golden grain, shimmering under a sun that has baked the earth for millennia. You can feel the dry heat on your skin, hear the whisper of the wind through the heavy heads of emmer, wheat and barley. You are about to eat a piece of bread from this very field. And if you were truly here, in ancient Mesopotamia, it's a near certainty that you wouldn't have many teeth left by the time you were 30. You probably wouldn't survive this. The romance of the past is often just a story we tell ourselves, and tonight, we are going to peel back that story to find the forgotten and often uncomfortable truth. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Your support makes these quiet explorations possible. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine the dawn of what we call civilization. Picture the land nestled between two great, life-giving rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. This is the Fertile Crescent, a place where humanity decided to stop wandering and start building. They built cities of mud brick that rose from the plains, created laws to govern themselves, and invented writing to keep track of it all. At the very heart of this revolution, this monumental shift in human existence, was a simple, profound invention: bread. We see it in our mind's eye as the ultimate symbol of home, of stability. Bread is community. It's the reward for a year of hard work, from sowing the seed to reaping the harvest. It's the food that fueled the builders of ziggurats and the scribes who etched the first stories onto clay. The image is so powerful, so deeply ingrained in our collective memory. We imagine a rustic, round loaf, pulled hot from a clay oven. The crust is a beautiful, deep brown, perhaps a little blistered from the fire. The inside, the crumb, is dense and hearty, smelling of toasted grains and the sweet magic of fermentation. This is the staff of life, the first and most important processed food, the very foundation of settled society. It's a beautiful, glamorous illusion, isn't it? The perfect, wholesome loaf that built the world. Now, let's bring you into that picture. A piece of this bread is offered to you. It's still warm. You lift it to your nose, and the aroma is indeed earthy and rich. It looks nourishing. It feels substantial in your hand. You take a bite, and that's when the illusion shatters. The first sensation is not the soft yield of the crumb or the crackle of the crust. It is a sound, a horrifying, grating sound that you feel reverberating up from your jaw into your skull. It is the sound of your own tooth enamel scraping against stone. It's a crunch, but not a pleasant one. It's the kind of crunch that makes you wince in pain, the kind that signals damage has been done. As you instinctively try to work the mouthful around, your tongue registers the texture. It's not bread. It's a gritty, abrasive paste. It's full of sand. It's full of tiny, sharp stone fragments. It's full of bits of hard, fibrous chaff that somehow survived the whole process. This isn't a one-off, a bad batch. This is the bread. This is the forgotten flavor of ancient Mesopotamia. It's not a spice, not an herb, not a special kind of grain. The most dominant, most inescapable flavor, or rather, texture, of their daily bread was grit. Every single loaf, every single meal, from the most humble farmer to the king in his palace, was a fresh assault on their dental health. So why? Why would the founders of civilization, the brilliant minds who invented the wheel and charted the stars, eat what was essentially sandpaper? It wasn't because they were careless or didn't know any better. The shocking reality was simply a product of their world, an unavoidable consequence of their technology. Let's follow the journey of the grain. It begins in the field, where you're standing. The harvest isn't done with a modern, clean cutting combine. It's done with a clay or wooden sickle, studded with tiny, sharp pieces of flint or obsidian. As the reapers swing the sickles low to the ground to get every last precious stalk, the flint blades chip and shatter. Macroscopic shards of stone fall among the wheat. The sickle itself scoops up the dry, dusty soil and fine sand with every cut. The grit has already begun to join the party. Next comes threshing. The cut grain is spread out on a hard packed earthen floor, a threshing floor. Then, animal oxen, perhaps air-driven around and around to trample the stalks, separating the grain kernels. With every heavy hoof fall, more dust is kicked up, more soil is ground into the harvest. Then, the winnowing. You've seen it in ancient paintings, A worker tosses the threshed grain into the air with a wooden scoop. The idea is that the wind, a gift from the god Enlil, will carry away the light, useless chaff, while the heavier grain kernels fall back to the blanket. It's a beautifully simple piece of physics, but we're in Mesopotamia, a land defined by arid plains and deserts. What else is the wind carrying? Sand. Fine, pervasive sand. It blows the chaff away, just as intended, but it simultaneously dusts the entire harvest with a fresh coat of silicates. But the main culprit, the primary source of this tooth-destroying grit, is the final step before baking, grinding the grain into flour. There are no steel roller mills here. The tool for the job is the quern stone. Imagine a large, slightly concave slab of stone, often sandstone or basalt, resting on the floor. This is the saddle quern. To use it, you kneel before it, holding a smaller, loaf-shaped stone, the rider or rubber. You place a handful of grain on the saddle and begin to grind, pushing and pulling the rider stone back and forth, for hours. With every single pass, as the grain is pulverized into flour, the two stones grind against each other. Tiny particles of the quern itself and from the sandstone, volcanic rock from the basalt are scraped off and mixed directly into the flour. There is no way to stop it. There is no sieve fine enough to separate this mineral dust from the precious flour. It is now an ingredient. So that first civilized bite wasn't just a bite of bread. It was a bite of the earth itself. It was the taste of the harvest field, the threshing floor, the desert wind, and the very stone used to make it. This was the fundamental trade-off. In exchange for the calories to build cities and the stability to create culture, you had to accept that every meal would slowly, painfully, grind your teeth down to the gums. This daily, back-breaking, tooth-destroying process wasn't an abstract concept. It was a physical reality that fell, day in and day out, upon a specific person, their hands, their knees, their back, shaping not just the flour, but their own body in the process. This daily, back-breaking, tooth-destroying process wasn't an abstract concept. It was a physical reality that fell, day in and day out, upon a specific person, their hands, their knees, their back, shaping not just the flour, but their own body in the process. And in ancient Mesopotamia, that person was almost always a woman. Let's conjure her image. History and art have given us a rather romantic picture. We see her kneeling gracefully on a woven mat inside a simple, mud brick home. The light from the doorway catches the fine dust of flour in the air, making it sparkle like gold. Her movements are rhythmic, practiced, almost meditative. She is the heart of the home, the quiet engine of her family's survival. With a steady, peaceful motion, she pushes the rider stone back and forth, and with each pass, the life-sustaining flour spills from the edges of the quern. It is an image of profound domesticity, of strength, of providing. It is the picture of civilization being built not just by kings and soldiers, but in the humble, repetitive actions of a single woman ensuring her family will eat. It's a beautiful, powerful illusion. It's a lie. Let's stay with her for a moment, but look closer. Not with the eyes of a poet, but with the eyes of a modern bioarchaeologist, someone who studies ancient skeletons. Let's peel back the skin and muscle and see the story her bones tell. The first thing we notice is her posture. She isn't kneeling gracefully. Her body is contorted into a position of maximum efficiency for a grueling task. She is forced onto her knees for hours at a time, grinding her kneecaps into the hard, packed earth. To stabilize herself for the powerful push-pull motion, she has to tuck her feet underneath her toes bent at an extreme angle, pressing into the floor. The skeletal remains of women from this period show a distinctive pattern, osteoarthritis in the knee joints, sometimes so severe the bones are polished smooth from grinding against each other, and her toes. They often have what archaeologists call quintoia permanent, arthritic deformation of the big toe joint, a testament to thousands of hours spent in this agonizing position. Now, watch her movement. That rhythmic push and pull isn't gentle. She has to put her entire body weight into it, leaning forward, engaging her back, her shoulders, her arms. Look at her spine. The lower vertebrae are compressed, worn down from the constant strain. Her arm and shoulder bones tell a similar story. Where the deltoid muscles attach to her upper arm, the bone isn't smooth, it's rough-ended and enlarged, a condition called musculoskeletal stress marking. Her body has literally built more bone to anchor the overdeveloped muscles she needs to perform this single, repetitive task. She is, in a very real sense, being reshaped by her tool. The stone grinds the grain, and it grinds her bones. And what does she hear? Not a gentle, meditative shushing sound. She hears the grating, screaming protest of stone on stone. It's a sound we would find unbearable, the sound of fingernails on a chalkboard amplified 100 times, but for her, it is the soundtrack to her life. It is the sound of food. It is the sound of survival. And with that sound, she sees the evidence of the damage. She sees the fine, grey dust of the stone mixing in with the cream-coloured flour of the grain. She can't separate it. She knows she is creating the very grit that will wear down her husband's teeth, her children's teeth, her own teeth. There is a tragic, unavoidable intimacy here. Her own physical suffering is directly creating the source of her family's future dental suffering. Why was this reality so universal? Because there was no other choice. This was it. This was the only technology available for making flour. It was a bottleneck in the food production process that demanded an incredible amount of time and human energy. It's estimated that grinding enough flour for a single family's daily bread could take 2 to 3 hours. Every single. This wasn't a chore you did when you had a spare moment. It was a central, non-negotiable pillar of a woman's daily existence. It defined her hours, shaped her body, and filled her home with the dust of stone and grain. This reality was so embedded in the culture that it became a metaphor for hardship and low status. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, when the wild man Enkidu is cursed, part of his grim future is that he will be shunned, and the woman he loves will be forced to stand in the dust of the crossroads, a phrase some scholars interpret as a metaphor for the lowest form of work, perhaps grinding grain for others as a public spectacle of poverty. Being the woman at the quern was fundamental, yes, but it was also a symbol of servitude. In a world of increasing specialization, the hardest, most monotonous work remained. So, now we have our flour. It is a testament to one woman's daily endurance. It is a mixture of crushed wheat and crushed stone, of nourishment and abrasion, created through a process that sustained life while simultaneously deforming the body of its creator. This gritty, painful flour is the raw material for every loaf in the land. But surely, this was just the reality for the common folk, for the farmers and the labourers. Surely the powerful, the wealthy, the priests and the kings living in their grand palaces in cities like Uruk and Babylon had a way around this. They had servants, they had resources, they had the finest of everything. Their bread must have been different. It must have been purer, whiter, free of this painful grit that plagued the lower classes. Surely the powerful, the wealthy, the priests and the kings living in their grand palaces in cities like Uruk and Babylon had a way around this. They had servants, they had resources, they had the finest of everything. Their bread must have been different. It must have been purer, whiter, free of this painful grit that plagued the lower classes. Their tables would have groaned under the weight of roasted meats, dates, figs and honey. And at the centre of it all, the bread, the ultimate status symbol, would have been a testament to their power and refinement. We can easily imagine the scene. You are in the audience hall of a Mesopotamian king. Polished alabaster reliefs line the walls, depicting the king as a mighty lion hunter and a pious servant of the gods. Incense, heavy with cedar and myrrh, hangs in the air. The king himself, draped in fine linen and adorned with gold and lapis lazuli, sits on a carved throne. Before him is a meal fit for a living deity, and on a golden platter sits his bread. It is not the coarse, brown loaf of the commoner. This is akalu, alubrite bread, or white bread. It's smaller, more delicate, perhaps shaped like a perfect crescent or a symmetrical roll. It's made from the most carefully selected, finely sifted flour, baked to a pale, pleasing colour. It represents the pinnacle of the baker's art, a food as far removed from the dirt of the field as possible. It is a bread of pure luxury, a glamorous illusion of untouchable perfection. To eat this bread is to partake in the king's own divine separation from the grit and grind of ordinary life. Now, let's pull back that curtain of incense and fine linen. Let's not look at the art on the walls. Let's look at the king himself. Or rather, what's left of him. Let's travel to the Royal Cemetery of Ur, excavated by Sir Leonard Woolley in the 1920s. Here we find the remains of the Sumerian elite, buried with staggering wealth, golden helmets, lyres decorated with bulls' heads and entire retinues of sacrificed servants. And here we find the skulls of the kings and queens themselves. We don't even need a microscope. You can just look at their teeth. What you see is a shocking, egalitarian horror. The king's teeth are, in many cases, just as bad, if not worse than those of the common woman kneeling at the quern. They are worn down, flattened, often right to the pulp. You can see the dark circles of exposed nerve cavities. You can see the telltale signs of massive dental abscessoles in the jawbone where infection raged, creating pockets of pus that would have caused agonizing, debilitating pain. Imagine the great King Ashurnasirpal, who boasted of his military conquests on his palace walls, rendered whimpering and unable to eat by a throbbing toothache. The evidence is undeniable. The mummies of Egyptian pharaohs, who shared a similar diet and grinding technology, show the same catastrophic dental wear. These were the most powerful people on earth, with the resources of entire empires at their command, yet they could not escape the grit. Their white bread was a lie. It was a fantasy. So why? Why couldn't the king, with all his power, command a grit-free loaf into existence? The reason is a simple, frustrating, technological barrier. Their pursuit of white bread actually made the problem worse. To make whiter flour, you had to grind it more. And the more you ground the grain on the quern stone, the more of the stone itself you ground into the flour. It was a terrible paradox. Every attempt to increase the refinement and purity of the flour actually increased its contamination with abrasive stone dust. You could sift it, of course. They had sieves, likely made of woven reeds or cloth. But these were primitive. They could get the bigger pieces of chaff out, but they were nowhere near fine enough to separate the microscopic particles of sand and stone from the flour particles of a similar size. So, the king's bread might have looked wetter. It might have had a finer texture to the touch. But this was merely a cosmetic improvement. In terms of its abrasive quality, it was just as bad, and sometimes even more densely packed with the tooth-destroying grit. The very process of trying to create a food that symbolized their elite status was poisoning them from the mouth down. This reality had profound consequences. A king or a high priest suffering from chronic dental pain is not a ruler at their best. It affects their mood, their judgment, their ability to govern. Historians and archaeologists speculate that this widespread dental disease was a constant, background hum of misery that affected every level of society. It wasn't just about the pain of eating. An abscess in the pre-antibiotic era was a potential death sentence. The infection could easily spread from the jaw to the bloodstream, leading to sepsis and a swift, feverish death. The staff of life was also, quite literally, a potential instrument of death. The king's gritty delicacy is a perfect metaphor for the limitations of power in the ancient world. You could build ziggurats that touch the sky, you could conquer your neighbors and demand tribute from 100 cities, you could command armies and scribes and artists. But you could not change the fundamental physics of stone grinding against stone. The king was trapped by the same technological reality as the humblest of his subjects. His power stopped at the surface of the quern stone. The bread on the king's table was a performance, a piece of political theatre. It looked pure, it looked exclusive, but it was just as contaminated as any other. And this performance of purity wasn't limited to the king's personal dining hall. It reached its most elaborate and theatrical form in the temples, where the bread wasn't just for mortals, but was prepared as a sacred meal for the gods themselves. The king's gritty delicacy was a performance, a piece of political theatre. It looked pure, it looked exclusive, but it was just as contaminated as any other. And this performance of purity wasn't limited to the king's personal dining hall. It reached its most elaborate and theatrical form in the temples, where the bread wasn't just for mortals, but was prepared as a sacred meal for the gods themselves. Step inside the temple complex of a great city like Nippur or Eridu. The air is thick with the smoke of burnt offerings and the expensive scent of juniper and cedar. This is the earthly home of the city's patron god, a place of immense power and sanctity. At the heart of the complex, in the most sacred inner sanctum, stands a statue of the deity, carved from precious wood and draped in real clothing, adorned with real jewelry. To the Mesopotamians, this was not a mere symbol. The god was believed to be physically present within the statue. And like any great lord, the god had needs. They had to be housed, clothed, entertained with music, and, most importantly, fed twice a day. A grand meal was presented to the statue. This was a spectacle of divine hospitality. A table was set before the idol, laden with the very best food the temple's vast estates could produce: roasted lamb, fruits, honey, beer, and of course, bread. This wasn't just any bread. This was neanderthal, the sacred offering bread, The temple bakeries employed specialists who created loaves in dozens of specific, ritually prescribed shapes and sizes. There were breads shaped like hearts, like the crescent moon of the god Sin, or like the tools of a shepherd for the god Dumuzi. These were baked from the finest, most laboriously prepared flour, representing the pinnacle of the culinary arts. It was a beautiful, solemn ritual. The god would consume the spiritual essence of the meal behind a linen curtain drawn for privacy, nourishing themselves on the devotion of their human servants. The glamorous illusion was that of a direct, tangible connection between heaven and earth, a perfectly prepared meal that sustained the cosmic order. Now, let's wait for the priests to draw that linen curtain closed. Let's watch what really happens to all that divine food. The god, being a statue, doesn't actually eat anything. The consumption is purely symbolic. So what happens to the enormous quantities of high-quality food, the dozens of specially baked loaves that are laid on the altar twice every day? Does it go to waste? Is it piously burned? The shocking reality is that the temple was also a giant, ritually justified food redistribution center. The gods were just the first to dine. After a suitable period, the curtain is drawn back and the food, now left over from the god's meal, is removed. This food, imbued with a divine blessing, is now known as the reversion or padu, and it goes directly to the temple staff. The high priest and his family get the best cuts of meat and the finest loaves. The lower-ranking priests, the scribes, the temple guards, the musicians, the singers, they all get their share, a sliding scale of divine leftovers that constituted their salary. Even the king would receive a portion, a tangible sign of his special relationship with the gods. What wasn't consumed by this vast temple bureaucracy was often sold in the city gates, providing another stream of revenue for the temple. The entire system was a masterpiece of sacred logistics. The gods owned vast tracts of agricultural land, and the people paid their tribute to the gods in the form of grain, livestock, and other goods. The temple administration then processed these raw materials into finished products like our gritty bread, offered them symbolically to the god, and then paid its own staff using those very same products. It was a closed economic loop, sanctified by religion. But let's not forget the central truth. Those beautiful, crescent-shaped loaves, those breads baked in the image of a god's heart, they were made from the same stone-ground flour as everything else. The high priest, chewing on his divinely blessed portion, was still grinding his teeth down on basalt dust. The temple singer, grateful for her ration, was still getting a mouthful of sand. The cosmic order may have been sustained by these offerings, but so was the dental misery of the entire religious apparatus. Why would they create such an elaborate system? It was, in essence, a way to legitimize and manage a massive economic enterprise. By framing the entire operation as service to the god, the temple could command labor and resources on a scale that rivaled the palace. The priests weren't just holy men. They were accountants, estate managers, and logistics experts. The daily ritual wasn't just about piety, it was about payroll. The worldview was that the universe was an estate, and the gods were the landowners. Humanity was created to be their servants, to relieve them of the burden of work, including feeding themselves. Providing these meals was humanity's fundamental purpose. The fact that the servants got to eat the leftovers was simply a practical and divinely sanctioned perk of the job. So, the sacred offering bread, for all its ritual purity and beautiful shapes, was a fiction. Its holiness was a laundering mechanism for what was, in essence, a salary system. It was as gritty and abrasive as the king's loaf and the farmer's loaf. But this incredibly useful, storable, and transportable staple had another, even more transformative secret hidden within its dense, sandy crumb. It wasn't just the staff of life. It was also the raw material for the drink of life. Another of Mesopotamia's great gifts to the world was born from these hard, gritty loaves. So, the sacred offering bread, for all its ritual purity and beautiful shapes, was a fiction. Its holiness was a laundering mechanism for what was, in essence, a salary system. It was as gritty and abrasive as the king's loaf and the farmer's loaf. But this incredibly useful, storable, and transportable staple had another, even more transformative secret hidden within its dense, sandy crumb. It wasn't just the staff of life. It was also the raw material for the drink of life. Another of Mesopotamia's great gifts to the world was born from these hard, gritty loaves. Let's picture the perfect companion to a hearty slice of bread, a cool, refreshing pint of beer. In our modern minds, the two are distinct but related pleasures. Beer is liquid bread, we say, a nod to their shared grainy origins. We imagine the Mesopotamians discovering this magical transformation with delight. Perhaps a baker left some dough or a porridge of grain out in the sun, and wild yeast worked its magic, creating a bubbly, slightly alcoholic brew. It's a happy accident, a moment of culinary genius that gives birth to the world's most popular alcoholic beverage. We envision them celebrating at festivals, toasting their gods and each other with frothy mugs of golden beer, a civilized and joyous pastime. It's a glamorous illusion of ancient parties and sophisticated brewing. Now, let's look at how they actually made their beer, their ca. The reality is far less romantic and much more crunchy. The key ingredient wasn't leftover bread dough or a carefully managed malt. It was a purpose-baked loaf called bappa. And bappa wasn't a bread you would ever want to eat. It wasn't soft. It wasn't meant to be palatable. It was a rock-hard, twice-baked, thoroughly dried slab of barley and emmer wheat. Think of the most indestructible military hardtack you can imagine, then make it even harder. The process was brutally simple. A dough of barley and other grains, probably including the hulls, and a healthy dose of grit from the quinstone was formed into lumps. These lumps were then baked once, perhaps on the hot ashes of a fire or in a cool oven. Not to cook them through, but to dry them out. Then, they were broken up, maybe sweetened with a little date syrup, and baked a second time until they were desiccated and nearly black. The resulting product was less a food and more a preserved grain concentrate. It was shelf-stable for years, resistant to mold and insects, and easy to transport. It was, in essence, a brick of instant beer mix. When it was time to brew, you wouldn't head to the larder for a sack of malted barley. You would take a hammer to your stash of bappa. These stone-hard, gritty bread rocks were shattered into pieces and soaked in water in large clay vats. To this mixture, they would add malted grain to provide the necessary enzymes to convert starch to sugar, and perhaps some date syrup to boost the fermentation. The mixture was left to sit, to bubble and ferment, with wild yeasts from the air and the clay vessel itself doing the work. The resulting beer was not the clear, filtered beverage we know. It was a thick, soupy, porridge-like concoction full of floating debris, bits of bread crust, grain hulls, and of course all the sand and stone dust that was baked into the original bappa. It would have had the consistency of a thin, lumpy oatmeal. It was so full of solids that it was undrinkable in the modern sense. To consume it, the Mesopotamians used one of their most iconic inventions, the drinking straw poo. You've seen them in the cylinder seals and reliefs, long, thin tubes, often made of reed or even precious metals like gold and silver for the elite. People would gather around a large communal pot of beer, dip their straws in, and drink together. The glamour of the golden straw is immediately undercut by its shocking, practical purpose. It was a filter. The straw's tip was designed to be placed below the surface of the thick scum of floating solids, allowing the drinker to suck up the liquid from underneath, leaving the worst of the gritty, chunky sediment behind. You weren't sipping elegantly, you were desperately trying to avoid getting a mouthful of indible sludge. Why on earth would they use this method? Why make bread just to break it up and turn it into a drink? The logic was one of preservation and control. Malted grain that has been sprouted and then dried is the ideal base for beer, but it's also highly attractive to weevils, mold, and other pests. It doesn't store well in a hot, arid climate. Bappa, on the other hand, was nearly indestructible. It was a way of capturing and preserving the potential of the grain in a stable, transportable form. A temple or palace could store vast quantities of bappa for years, ensuring a steady supply of beer for rations, rituals, and trade, immune to the vagaries of a bad harvest or spoilage. It was a brilliant solution for long-term resource management. The beer itself was a cornerstone of their diet. It was a crucial source of calories, vitamins, and hydration, often safer to drink than water from canals, which could be contaminated. It was given as a daily ration to labourers building the ziggurats and digging the canals. But just like the bread ration, the beer ration was another daily dose of the same old problem. Even with a straw, you couldn't avoid consuming some of the fine silt and grit suspended in the liquid. Every sip of beer was another small contribution to the relentless abrasion of your teeth. So, the link between bread and beer wasn't just a quaint liquid bread metaphor. It was a direct, industrial process. They baked indible, gritty loaves specifically to create a sludgy, gritty beer. This process gave them security and a staple beverage, but it also ensured that the inescapable flavour of Mesopotamia, the grit, was present not just in their food, but in their drink as well. Even when they tried to enhance the flavour, to make their gritty food more palatable with spices and aromatics, they were often just hiding a deeper, more unpleasant truth. Even when they tried to enhance the flavor, to make their gritty food more palatable with spices and aromatics, they were often just hiding a deeper, more unpleasant truth. The Mesopotamians were not culinary minimalists. Their clay tablets are filled with references to a surprising variety of flavorings, painting a picture of a sophisticated palate. Let's imagine you are at a banquet, not for a king, but for a wealthy merchant. The bread served here isn't just plain barley bread. It's fragrant. The baker has been creative. You are offered a small loaf studded with dark specks. You take a bite, wincing slightly at the inevitable grit, and your senses are awakened by a wave of complex flavors. You taste the sharp, pungent kick of onion and garlic, the warm, slightly licorice-like notes of cumin and coriander, and perhaps the nutty richness of sesame seeds. The variety is dazzling. It suggests a cuisine that celebrated flavor, that sought to delight the senses. The glamorous illusion is that of a proto-gourmet culture, a people who, despite the technological limitations, were masters of seasoning, using spices to elevate their humble bread into a culinary delight. It's a feast for the senses, a testament to their refined tastes. Now, let's taste that bread again. But this time with a more cynical, ancient tongue. Let's consider, not just what flavors are present, but why they needed to be so strong. The shocking reality is that these powerful spices were often not used for culinary elevation, but for gustatory misdirection. They were a mask. A fragrant, pungent, delicious mask for the taste of things going wrong. Let's go back to our flour. We know it's full of grit, but it's also ground in small batches, daily, because it doesn't keep. In the heat and occasional humidity of Mesopotamia, finely ground flour goes rancid incredibly quickly. The oils in the grain begin to oxidize, creating a sour, musty, and deeply unpleasant taste. There's no climate-controlled pantry, no vacuum-sealed bags. The flour you grind in the morning might already be starting to turn by the evening. So, what do you do with flour that's slightly off? You don't throw it away. Every handful of flour represents hours of back-breaking labor at the quinstone. It's far too precious to waste. Instead, you cover it up. You knead in a generous amount of crushed garlic, a handful of toasted cumin seeds, or a good measure of dried herbs. These strong, assertive flavors are brilliant at overpowering the subtle but unpleasant taste of incipient spoilage. The delicious, spicy bread on the merchant's table might not be a sign of his sophisticated palate, but a grimly practical way to use up ingredients that were on the verge of being inedible. The spices weren't an addition, they were a correction. And it wasn't just the flour that was the problem. Think about the other ingredients. The water comes from a canal or a well, and might have its own swampy, flat taste. The leaven or sort of starter they didn't have commercial yeast was a living culture, passed down from batch to batch. If it became contaminated with the wrong kinds of wild yeasts or bacteria, it could produce sour, off-putting flavors in the final loaf. Again, the solution is not to start over. The solution is more cumin, more onions, more garlic. This principle of using strong flavors to mask undesirable ones was a fact of life before refrigeration. It's why heavily spiced cured meats were the mainstay of European cuisine for centuries. In Mesopotamia, it was simply applied to their most basic foodstuff. The punchy, aggressive seasoning wasn't necessarily about creating a perfectly balanced flavor profile. It was about winning a war against the forces of decay. Why was this approach so logical to them? It stems from a worldview of scarcity and intense effort. In a world where every calorie is won through hard physical labor, you don't have the luxury of our modern fussiness. The concept of best before dates would be utterly alien. Food is either edible, or it's not, and the line between the two is much blurrier than ours. If a bit of spoilage can be masked by a powerful spice, then it is still perfectly good food. Waste was the real sin, not a slightly off flavor. The gods, particularly the god of the grain, had provided this bounty. To let it spoil and throw it away would be an insult, a sign of ingratitude. So you do what you must. You salvage, you mask, you eat. This practice even extended to their sweeteners. They loved adding dates, figs, and honey to their breads to create sweet cakes and pastries. On the surface, this looks like pure indulgence. But sugar is also a preservative. The thick, sugary date paste kneaded into the dough could help to keep it from spoiling as quickly, extending its usable life by another day or so. The sweetness was a bonus, but its primary function may have been, once again, a practical one. So the next time you see a recipe for ancient Mesopotamian spiced bread, Remember the hidden truth. The fragrant cloud of cumin and coriander might just be a smokescreen. Beneath the delicious, deliberate flavor of the spice lies the ghost of another, less pleasant one, the sour tang of rancid flour, the taste of a world without preservatives, where every meal was a race against time and decay. The grit wore down your teeth, and the spices fought a constant battle to convince your tongue that what you were eating was still good. Even the very place where the bread was baked, the communal heart of the village, added its own unique, and not entirely welcome, layer of flavor to the final product. The grit wore down your teeth, and the spices fought a constant battle to convince your tongue that what you were eating was still good. Even the very place where the bread was baked, the communal heart of the village, added its own unique, and not entirely welcome, layer of flavor to the final product. Let's move from the private space of the home to the shared, public space of the oven. For many, owning a private oven was a luxury. The more common reality was the communal oven, a hub of village life, especially for women. We imagine a beautiful scene, a precursor to the village bakeries of old Europe. It's a large, domed structure of clay, radiating a comforting warmth. Women gather here, their dough ready in wooden bowls. There's a sense of community, of shared work and gossip, as they wait for their turn at the fire. The air smells of baking bread, one of the most comforting aromas in the world. The baker, a respected figure, skillfully slaps the flattened dough against the hot inner wall of the oven. A few minutes later, she peels off a perfectly baked, slightly smoky flatbread. It is the image of a warm, functional, and clean community hearth. Now, let's get closer to that oven. Let's feel its real heat and breathe its real air. Let's watch the process not as a romantic painting, but as a practical, messy reality. The oven itself is called a tanner or tanru, a design so effective it's still used across the Middle East and South Asia today as the tandoor. It's essentially a large, cylindrical or beehive-shaped clay jar, sometimes partially buried in the ground for insulation. You don't bake in it in the modern sense. You bake on it. A fire is built inside the cylinder, heating the interior clay walls to scorching temperatures. When the fire dies down to glowing embers, the oven is ready. Here comes the first shocking reality. What is the fuel for this fire? Wood is scarce and expensive in the arid plains of Mesopotamia. The primary fuel source is not clean burning oak. It's dried animal dung. Donkey, cattle, sheep dung, whatever is available is collected, mixed with straw, formed into cakes and dried in the sun. This was the universal fuel of the ancient world. So, that comforting smell of the bakery. You need to add another, more acrid note to it, the sharp, pungent smell of burning animal waste. The fire that heats the oven wall is coating it with a fine layer of dung ash. Now, watch the baker. She has her flattened round of dough. To get it to stick to the vertical inner wall of the superheated oven, she has to work fast. She slaps it against the wall with her bare hand or a small cushion. The wet dough adheres to the hot clay, and the intense heat cooks it in minutes, causing it to bubble up. But what is it sticking to? It's sticking to a surface that has just been blasted by a fire of dried dung. It's sticking to a wall that is inevitably coated in a fine powder of soot and ash from that fire. When she peels the finished bread off the wall, it doesn't come away perfectly clean. A little bit of that ashy, sooty coating comes with it, baked right into the surface of the loaf. Look at the finished flatbread. It's beautifully blistered and browned in spots, but the underside, the part that was in direct contact with the oven wall, is streaked with grey and black. That isn't a flavorful char from a wood-fired pizza oven. That is ash. Some of it is wood ash, if they were lucky, but a good portion of it is the residue of incinerated animal feces. This was an unavoidable part of the process. You couldn't wipe the oven clean. It was too hot, and it would just get coated again with the next fire. This layer of ash was simply accepted as part of the bread's crust. So to our list of ingredients: grain, water, salt, grit. We must now add another, ash. Every bite of bread contains not just the earth of the field and the stone of the quern, but the residue of the fire that cooked it. Why was this perfectly acceptable? Again, it's a matter of practicality and a different standard of cleanliness. The concept of germ theory is thousands of years in the future. The ash is not seen as unclean or unhygienic in our modern sense. It's just a natural byproduct of the cooking process. The fire is a purifying force. Anything that passes through it is, in a way, cleansed. The fact that the fuel source was animal dung was not disgusting. It was a clever and sustainable use of a readily available resource. In a world without abundant forests, it was a vital innovation. To them, the smell of a dung fire wasn't foul, it was the smell of a hot meal to come. Furthermore, the communal oven, for all its messiness, was a vital social institution. It was a place where information was exchanged, where women forged bonds, and where the daily work of survival was made a little easier by sharing the burden. The quality of the oven and its fuel was a given. The focus was on the community it created. So, that seemingly perfect loaf, pulled fresh from the oven, is a far more complex object than we imagine. It's a geological and biological record of its own creation. The grit tells the story of the harvest and the grinding. The spices tell the story of the fight against spoilage. And the ash on its crust tells the story of the very fire that gave it form. This bread, a food that seems so pure and wholesome, was in reality a catalogue of the harsh compromises of ancient life. But its uses weren't limited to feeding the living and the gods. In a world with no scientific medicine, this gritty, ashy, often spiced loaf was also considered a powerful tool for healing the sick. This bread, a food that seems so pure and wholesome, was in reality a catalogue of the harsh compromises of ancient life. But its uses weren't limited to feeding the living and the gods. In a world with no scientific medicine, this gritty, ashy, often spiced loaf was also considered a powerful tool for healing the sick. Let's enter the world of Mesopotamian medicine. The physician, or as, is a respected figure, a blend of doctor, pharmacist, and magician. We imagine him tending to a patient, perhaps someone with a fever or a painful wound. He consults his clay tablets, centuries of collected medical knowledge. His remedies are based on careful observation, a deep understanding of herbal properties, and a desire to bring comfort and healing. And at the heart of many of his prescriptions is bread. Bread is used as a binder for poultices, a vehicle for delivering medicinal herbs, a soothing food for the infirm. The image is one of gentle, natural healing. A poultice of bread and healing herbs is applied to a wound, or a special, easily digestible bread is prescribed for a patient with an upset stomach. It's a glamorous illusion of ancient holistic medicine, where the staff of life is also the staff of healing. Now, let's look at what was actually in some of those medical loaves. Let's read the prescriptions etched into the cuneiform tablets, not with a romantic eye, but with the cold, hard gaze of a modern pharmacist. The shocking reality is that the ingredients prescribed to be mixed with or applied via bread were often bizarre, disgusting, and medically counterintuitive. A prescription for a wound dressing might indeed start with bread, but then it instructs thee as to mix it with a frightening cocktail of other substances. One text calls for a poultice made of bread, turtle shell powder, and human urine. Another, for a skin ailment, requires a paste of bread, river mud, and pulverized donkey dung. For an internal complaint, a patient might be instructed to eat a special medical bread in which ingredients like dog feces or the fat from a black snake have been baked. You heard that right. These weren't fringe quack remedies. They are right there in the mainstream medical texts, preserved in the library of King Ashurbanipal. The wholesome, healing loaf becomes a delivery system for what we would consider filth. Imagine you are the patient. You have a painful, infected gash on your leg. The physician arrives, and instead of cleaning it, he applies a warm, moist poultice of gritty bread mixed with animal excrement. He is not trying to harm you. He is administering the best medical care his civilization has to offer. What was the logic behind this seemingly insane practice? Why would they deliberately apply filth to an open wound or instruct a sick person to eat feces? The worldview of Mesopotamian medicine was fundamentally different from ours. While they did have a grasp of some practical herbalism, their understanding of disease was rooted in magic and appeasing the gods. Sickness was often seen as a punishment from a deity, or the result of an attack by a malevolent demon. Therefore, the cure had to operate on a magical level as well. The principle at play here is a form of sympathetic magic, an ancient-like cures-like or like expels-like philosophy. Many of these disgusting ingredients were chosen because they were considered powerfully repellent. The logic was that if you made the patient's body or their wound so disgusting and inhospitable, the demon causing the sickness would be disgusted and flee. You weren't treating the infection in a biological sense. You were trying to gross out a supernatural entity. The foul smell of the dung, the ritual impurity of the urinthes, were not unfortunate side effects. They were the active ingredients. There was also the idea of similia similibus, where a substance was chosen based on a symbolic connection. For a patient who was jaundiced and yellow, you might use a remedy with a yellow ingredient. For a problem with the liver considered the seat of emotions, you might use the liver of an animal. Bread, in this context, served as the perfect base. It was absorbent, it could be molded, and it was a neutral, common substance that could be magically activated by the addition of these more powerful, and often repulsive, ingredients. Let's not forget our central theme, the grit. The bread used in these poultices was the same sandy, stony bread everyone ate. So, when the physician applied that dung and bread paste to your wound, he wasn't just introducing bacteria from the feces, he was also scrubbing the wound with an abrasive compound full of sharp, microscopic particles of stone and sand. This would have caused further tissue damage, opened up new avenues for infection, and driven bacteria deeper into the wound. While their intention was to heal, their methods were often a recipe for rampant infection, gangrene, and sepsis. The healing loaf was, in many cases, an instrument of unintentional torture and a potential death sentence. This medical bread stands as one of the starkest examples of the gap between their world and ours. It takes the fundamental substance of their survival, gritty, ashy, everyday bread, and transforms it into a weapon in a magical war against invisible demons, with the patient's body as the battlefield. It's a chilling reminder that good intentions are no substitute for scientific understanding. And just as this bread was a tool to manage the health of individuals, it was also a tool on a much grander scale, a way to manage and control the vast armies of laborers who built the Mesopotamian world. And just as this bread was a tool to manage the health of individuals, it was also a tool on a much grander scale, a way to manage and control the vast armies of laborers who built the Mesopotamian world. Picture the great construction projects of the ancient Near East. Tens of thousands of men are at work, hauling massive stones, shaping mud bricks, and digging the vast network of canals that irrigated the entire civilization. Under the brutal sun, they are building the ziggurat at Ur, or the Ishtar Gate of Babylon. It's a vision of immense, coordinated power, of human will reshaping the landscape. And what fuels this incredible engine of manpower? Rations. The state provides for its workers, ensuring they have the energy to complete these monumental tasks. At the heart of this system is the ration loaf. We imagine a scene of gratitude. At the end of a long day, a foreman hands out hefty, nourishing loaves of bread and jars of beer to the tired but proud workers. This bread is their wage, their reward, the social contract in action. It's the glamorous illusion of a well-organized state caring for its workforce, the staff of life fueling the creation of wonders. Now, let's look closer at that ration loaf. Let's not see it as a symbol of the social contract, but as an instrument of power and a record of human cost. The shocking reality is that this bread was a tool of profound control, and the payment system it represented was a double-edged sword that fueled great works while systematically destroying the bodies of the workers. The most famous evidence for this is the bevel-rimmed bowl, one of the most common and yet mysterious artifacts from the Uruk period, around 3500 BCE. Archaeologists have found millions of these things. They are crude, ugly, mass-produced pottery bowls, all of a roughly standard size. For a long time, their purpose was a puzzle. Now, the prevailing theory is that these were disposable ration containers. They were the ancient equivalent to the styrofoam cup. Imagine the scene. A worker, perhaps a prisoner of war, a debtor, or a citizen performing compulsory state labor corv, lines up at the end of the day. A temple or state official doesn't hand him a warm, personal loaf. Instead, they scoop a standardized portion of gritty grain dough into a mass-produced bevel-rimmed bowl, or perhaps hand over a pre-baked, bowl-shaped loaf. This is your wage. It's impersonal, it's standardized, it's efficient. This system allowed the state to calculate, with chilling precision, the exact caloric input needed to get a certain amount of labor output from its human machinery. It wasn't about nourishment in a caring sense, it was about fuel for an engine. And the fuel itself was, of course, the grittiest of the gritty. If the king's bread was full of sand despite his best efforts, imagine the quality of the flour used for mass-producing rations for a disposable workforce. The grain would have been of the lowest quality, the grinding done hastily on the most worn-out stones, producing a flour that was likely more than 10% pure grit by volume. This wasn't just bread, it was an abrasive paste served in a clay dish. Let's follow the biological consequences. A worker eats this bread day in, day out, for years. The relentless grit grinds his teeth down. The pain starts. Chewing becomes difficult. Abscesses form. He gets sick more often. His productivity drops. From the cold perspective of the state administrator, he is a machine that is wearing out. But he is also replaceable. there are always more labourers. The skeletal remains of these populations show exactly what we'd expect. Appalling dental health, far worse than even the elite. They were, quite literally, grinding their teeth away in service to the state, and the very wage they were paid was the instrument of their physical destruction. Why would a society operate this way? The logic is one of scale and the birth of the bureaucratic state. To build a ziggurat, you need to mobilize and feed thousands. This requires a system. The bevel-rimmed bowl and the bread ration represent one of humanity's first experiments in mass administration. It's the invention of the standardized unit of payment. This is not about individual relationships, it's about managing a massive, anonymous workforce. The state needed a way to pay people that was cheap, easy to produce, and directly tied to the agricultural surplus that formed the basis of its wealth. Grain, and by extension bread, was the perfect answer. It was the ancient world's dollar. This system also reinforced the social hierarchy. The quality of the bread you ate was a direct reflection of your status. The king ate his white, extra gritty bread from a golden platter. The priest ate his blessed, gritty bread from the temple reversion. And the labourer ate his sandy, mass-produced ration loaf from a disposable clay bowl. The grit was the great equalizer in one sense. Everyone suffered from it, but the quality and quantity of the bread defined your place in the world. The labourer's ration was not just food. It was a constant, painful reminder of his low status. This obsession with the appearance of the bread, even when the underlying reality was the same, speaks volumes. The desire for a whiter, purer-looking loaf was a powerful social driver. It created a visual distinction between the classes, even if the physical experience of eating it was universally terrible for the teeth. This impossible quest for a truly white, pure bread, free from the sins of the earth and the stone, became a kind of holy grail for Mesopotamian bakers and their wealthy patrons. The labourer's ration was not just food, it was a constant, painful reminder of his low status. The grit was the great equalizer in one sense. Everyone suffered from it, but the quality and quantity of the bread defined your place in the world. This obsession with the appearance of the bread, even when the underlying reality was the same, speaks volumes. The desire for a whiter, purer-looking loaf was a powerful social driver. It created a visual distinction between the classes, even if the physical experience of eating it was universally terrible for the teeth. This impossible quest for a truly white, pure bread, free from the sins of the earth and the stone, became a kind of holy grail for Mesopotamian bakers and their wealthy patrons. Let's step into the bakery of a high-status household, one that serves a governor or a wealthy merchant. Here, the pursuit of whiteness is an art form, a daily struggle against the realities of their technology. The glamorous illusion is one of culinary alchemy. We see the baker as a master craftsman, a specialist with secret techniques. He starts with the most expensive, carefully selected hulled wheat. He supervises the grinding, demanding that the women at the quern stones work slowly, carefully, to minimize stone dust. He uses the finest linen sieves, sifting the flour not once, but 2 or 3 times, letting clouds of the coarser, darker particles drift away. The resulting flour is pale, soft, and precious. He bakes it carefully, not in a crude dung-fired tanner, but in a more controlled, wood-fired oven that won't blacken the crust with ash. The final product, the ekalu elu or white bread, is a triumph of refinement over nature. It is a symbol of wealth, purity, and the power to command immense labor for a seemingly simple goal. Now, let's look past the baker's performance and analyze the futility of his efforts. Let's pick up one of his beautiful, pale loaves and hold it in the harsh Mesopotamian sunlight. The shocking reality is that this quest for whiteness was an expensive, labor-intensive, and ultimately doomed exercise in self-deception. No matter how many times the baker sifted the flour, he could never overcome the fundamental problem we've discussed. The microscopic grit from the quern stone was the same size as the fine flour particles. A sieve that was fine enough to catch the stone dust would also catch the best part of the flour. So, his sifting only removed the larger pieces of bran and chaff. This made the bread paler, but it did absolutely nothing to reduce the tooth-destroying grit. In fact, as we learned with the king's bread, the extra grinding required to get a fine texture often increased the total amount of stone dust in the final product. The entire effort was cosmetic. It was about creating a visual representation of purity. The bread wasn't actually purer in the sense of being cleaner or safer to eat, it just looked that way, and achieving this look was incredibly wasteful. For every measure of white flour the baker produced, a significant amount of perfectly good, nutritious flour and bran was sifted out. This lower-grade flour would then be used to bake the coarser, darker bread for the servants. So the creation of the master's white bread simultaneously created the servant's brown bread, reinforcing the class structure through the very act of food processing. The servants, ironically, might have ended up with a slightly less gritty, more nutritious loaf, as their flour wasn't ground as excessively. Why embark on this impossible quest? The logic is rooted in the powerful symbolism of color. In many ancient cultures, including Mesopotamia, whiteness was associated with purity, sanctity, and high status. It represented a separation from the dirt, the earth, and the manual labor of the fields. Darker bread was the bread of farmers and laborers, their hands and their food stained by the soil. To eat white bread was to assert that you were not one of them. You were above the muck and grime of the physical world. It was a social performance, and the bread was a prop. This obsession with whiteness also reveals a deep-seated anxiety. The Mesopotamians were keenly aware of their dependence on the earth, on the unpredictable rivers and the harsh climate. The grit in their bread was a constant reminder of this vulnerability, a taste of the messy, uncontrollable natural world in every bite. The quest for white bread was a quest for control, an attempt to create a food that was wholly a product of human artifice, free from the taint of the wild. It was an effort to deny their own earthy nature. Think of the resources poured into this effort. The finest grain, the extra hours of labor for grinding and sifting, the expensive, clean-burning fuel for the special oven. All of this to produce a loaf that was visually pleasing to the elite, but was still, fundamentally, the same gritty, abrasive substance as the laborer's ration. It was a colossal waste of energy and resources, driven entirely by social anxiety and the need to maintain class distinctions. The white loaf on the master's table wasn't a symbol of purity, it was a symbol of denial. This act of providing for oneself, of creating a specific kind of bread for a specific status, didn't end with death. The Mesopotamians believed in an afterlife, but it was not a heavenly paradise. It was a bleak and dreary place, and the provisions you were buried with were all you had to sustain you. And so, the final loaf you took with you on your journey was perhaps the most important one of all. This act of providing for oneself, of creating a specific kind of bread for a specific status, didn't end with death. The Mesopotamians believed in an afterlife, but it was not a heavenly paradise. It was a bleak and dreary place, and the provisions you were buried with were all you had to sustain you, and so, the final loaf you took with you on your journey was perhaps the most important one of all. Let's follow a soul into the Mesopotamian underworld, the land of no return, also known as Urkala. In the funerary rites, the living take great care to provide for their departed loved ones. The body is washed, anointed with oil, and wrapped in clean garments. Around the deceased, they place grave goods, tools they used in life, a few personal ornaments, and crucially, food and drink for the long journey ahead. Clay vessels are filled with water or beer, and alongside them are placed offerings of bread. We imagine this as a tender, loving gesture. It's a final meal packed by the family, a comforting provision to ease the soul's passage into the next world. The bread is a symbol of continued care, a last taste of home, a promise that the deceased will not be hungry in the afterlife. It's a beautiful, poignant illusion of eternal sustenance. Now, let's see where that soul and that loaf of bread are actually going. Let's read the texts that describe the underworld, like the descent of Ishtar or a chilling passage in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The shocking reality of the Mesopotamian afterlife is that it is a place of profound sensory deprivation and misery. It is a dark, gloomy kingdom ruled by the goddess Ereshkigal. When a new soul arrives, they are stripped of their earthly clothes and ornaments. The underworld is often called the House of Dust, and the descriptions of what the dead eat are horrifying. In one text, the goddess Ishtar threatens that if she is not allowed into the underworld, she will raise up the dead, and they will eat the living. But when she gets there, she finds the reality is the reverse. The dead are clothed like birds, with wings for garments, and their existence is one of perpetual twilight. And their food. Dust is their sustenance. One text says, and clay is their food. The souls of the dead, the Itami, sit in darkness and eat dirt. So what happens to that loving offering of bread placed in the tomb? It becomes a cruel joke, a temporary reprieve from an eternal fate. The soul might have that one last loaf, that one last jar of beer, but once it's gone, that's it. The future is an eternity of eating the very ground they are buried in. The carefully prepared bread, with all its familiar grit, is just a fleeting memory before an endless diet of literal dust and clay. It's a terrifying prospect. The problem of grit in your food in life becomes the totality of your food in death. Why imagine such a relentlessly grim afterlife? This worldview wasn't born from a lack of imagination, but from a keen observation of reality. What happens to a body when you bury it? It decays, it turns to dust, it becomes one with the earth. What happens to the food offerings you leave at a grave? They rot, they are eaten by worms, they too turn to dust. The Mesopotamian afterlife was a direct, unsentimental extrapolation of the process of decomposition. They saw no evidence of a heavenly paradise, so they didn't invent one. They saw dust and decay, and so they envisioned an eternity of dust and decay. This belief system also served a powerful social function. It placed an immense emphasis on life, on making your name and building your legacy in this world, because there was no second chance, no reward waiting for you in the next. Your only immortality was in the memory of the living. And crucially, it obligated the living to continue to care for the dead. Families were expected to perform regular rituals, pouring out water libations and leaving food offerings for their ancestral spirits. These spirits could eat the essence of these offerings, providing them with a little relief from their dusty diet. If you neglected your ancestors, your ancestral spirits could become angry and escape the underworld to haunt you and cause trouble. So, the loaf of bread in the tomb was not just a one-time packed lunch. It was the first installment in a perpetual contract of care between the living and the dead. The quality of the bread you offered to your ancestors reflected your piety and your social standing. The king might decree grand monthly offerings for his spirit, while a poor family could only afford a small, coarse barley loaf. But rich or poor, the offering was a desperate attempt to stave off that horrible, dusty fate for their loved ones. The final loaf wasn't a comfort, it was a tragic, insufficient shield against an eternity of eating dirt. The only people who truly understood the full scope of this system, from the grain in the field to the ration for the dead, were the scribes. They were the ones who kept the records, tallied the harvests, and wrote down the myths. Their pristine clay tablets seem to offer us a clear window into their world, but the truth about bread is hidden there, too, if you know how to read between the lines. The only people who truly understood the full scope of this system, from the grain in the field to the ration for the dead, were the scribes. They were the ones who kept the records, tallied the harvests, and wrote down the myths. Their pristine clay tablets seem to offer us a clear window into their world, but the truth about bread is hidden there, too, if you know how to read between the lines. Let's enter the Edubba, the tablet house or scribal school. Here, young boys from wealthy families spend years learning the complex cuneiform script. The air is quiet, focused. We see a master scribe, a man of great learning and status, inspecting a freshly inscribed tablet. The wedge-shaped marks are perfect, the lines are straight, the clay is smooth. The tablet is a masterpiece of information management. It might be a record of grain distribution from a temple granary, listing quantities of barley and emmer wheat allocated for bread production. It might be a lexical list, a kind of dictionary, with dozens of different words for various types of bread, categorized by shape, quality, and ingredients. The glamorous illusion is one of perfect order and clarity. These tablets are the hard data of history, the unvarnished truth recorded by meticulous, objective accountants. They are the ultimate primary source, giving us the facts, plain and simple. Now, let's pick up one of these tablets and learn to read it like a Mesopotamian, not just for what it says, but for what it doesn't say. The shocking reality is that these official records are a form of propaganda, designed to project an image of control and abundance, while hiding the messy, gritty reality. The scribe's job isn't just to record facts, it's to present the institution he works, Fourth Temple or the palace, in the best possible light. The numbers on the tablets are often idealized. They represent the amount of grain that should have been harvested, or the number of bread loaves that should have been produced. They don't account for spoilage, for pest infestations, for theft, or for the simple fact that a portion of the flour is actually non-nutritious stone dust. Let's look at one of those lexical lists, with over 300 different words for bread. On the surface, it looks like evidence of a vibrant, diverse culinary culture with an incredible range of baked goods. But when you analyze the terms, you start to see a different story. Many of the different breads are distinguished by minor, almost trivial details. There are terms for bread with a hole, bread that is long, bread that is twisted, bread that is pale, bread that is dark. A lot of this isn't a baker's menu. It's a bureaucrat's inventory. The scribe needs a precise term for every possible category of bread ration for his accounting. He needs to distinguish the bread given to the weaver from the bread given to the canal digger. The variety is not necessarily for the pleasure of the consumer, but for the precision of the bookkeeper. More importantly, the tablets never, ever mention the grit. There is no cuneiform sign for unpleasantly sandy. There's no column in the inventory for percentage of stone dust. This crucial detail, this defining characteristic of their daily food, is completely absent from the official record. It was so universal, so mundane, that it wasn't worth recording. It would be like a modern accountant making a note that the office workers breathed air. The grit was a given. It was the baseline of existence. Reading between the lines of these tablets requires a kind of forensic imagination. When you see a record of a temple sending a large shipment of fine flour to a neighboring city, you can't take it at face value. You have to remember the woman at the Kun stone. You have to imagine the sifting process, the waste involved. You have to know that fine is a relative term, a piece of marketing language. The tablet projects an image of quality and generosity, but the reality for the person eating the bread made from that flour is still a mouthful of sand. Why was the official record so sanitized? The logic lies in the very purpose of writing in Mesopotamia. Writing was invented for accounting, for control. Its purpose was to manage resources and project power. An official temple record that said, "We distributed 100 kilos of our usual sandy flour, which will likely cause painful dental abscesses in the recipients," would defeat the entire purpose. The goal is to record that the temple fulfilled its obligations, that the gods were satisfied, that the state is orderly and functional. The tablets were instruments of institutional self-preservation. They created a parallel reality, a world on clay that was much cleaner, more efficient, and more impressive than the real world outside the tablet house. The scribes themselves were part of this sanitized world. They were part of the elite. They didn't grind the grain. They didn't bake the bread. But they did eat it. And their own skeletons, when we find them, tell the same story as the kings. Their teeth are worn down, too. They may have had access to the witter bread, but they couldn't escape the grit. In their own bodies, they carried the truth that they so carefully omitted from their official records. So, the clay tablets are not a clear window, but a curtain. They show us the world the elite wanted to see, a world of order, abundance, and hundreds of kinds of bread. But the silence of the tablets on the issue of grit is deafening. It tells us more than any written word could. It tells us that the defining flavor of their world was so common, so inescapable, that it was beneath mention. This single food item, this staff of life, was both their greatest asset and a source of constant, low-grade pain for everyone. So, the clay tablets are not a clear window, but a curtain. They show us the world the elite wanted to see, a world of order, abundance, and hundreds of kinds of bread. But the silence of the tablets on the issue of grit is deafening. It tells us more than any written word could. It tells us that the defining flavor of their world was so common, so inescapable, that it was beneath mention. This single food item, this staff of life, was both their greatest asset and a source of constant, low-grade pain for everyone. Let's take a moment to reflect on that phrase, the staff of life. It's a biblical, almost sacred term. It conjures an image of bread as a reliable support, something that sustains you, that you can lean on in times of need. For the Mesopotamians, this was true on a civilizational level. Bread, and the agricultural surplus it represented, was the staff that supported their entire social structure. It allowed them to build cities, field armies, and develop complex religious and political institutions. Without the storable, transportable, rationable calories of gritty bread, the world's first civilization would have been impossible. The glamour of this illusion is immense. It's the story of human progress, of our climb from hunter-gatherers to city dwellers, all thanks to a humble loaf of bread. Now, let's look at that staff not as a metaphorical support, but as a literal weapon. A blunt instrument. Let's consider the lifelong physical consequences for the individual who depended on it. The shocking reality is that the staff of life was also the source of lifelong, chronic, and often fatal pain. We have pieced this story together section by section, but let's assemble it into a single, grim human life cycle. A child is weaned and begins to eat solid food. One of their first foods is a porridge, or a soft piece of bread soaked in water or milk. From their very first meals, the abrasive grit begins its work on their soft, new baby teeth. As they grow, bread is their primary source of calories. Every single day, 3 times a day, they chew this sandy paste. By the time they are a teenager, their molars, the primary grinding teeth, already show significant wear. The beautiful, complex landscape of cusps and valleys on the tooth surface has been worn down, flattened. By the time this person is a young adult in their 20s, the enamel on their molars is likely worn completely through in spots, exposing the softer dentin underneath. This dentin wears away even faster. The teeth become flat, featureless planes. Chewing tough foods becomes less efficient and more painful. Food, especially fibrous vegetable matter, gets trapped in the gaps between worn-down teeth, promoting decay. By age 30, a time when a modern person is in their physical prime, our Mesopotamian is in a state of chronic dental crisis. The wear has reached the pulp cavity at the center of the tooth, exposing the nerve. This leads to constant, agonizing toothaches. The exposed pulp is an open door for bacteria. Infections take hold, forming painful abscesses at the root of the tooth, pockets of pus that build up in the jawbone. Their face swells up. They are racked with fever. They can't eat. Remember, this is a world without antibiotics, without painkillers, without dentists. The only cure for a bad tooth was to let it rot until it fell out, or perhaps have a specialist try to knock it out with a chisel. This wasn't an occasional problem. It was an epidemic. Archaeological studies of skeletal remains from this period and region show that severe dental wear and abscesses were nearly universal in the adult population. It was a shared, background hum of misery for the entire culture. Imagine a world where almost every adult you know is suffering from some form of dental pain. It would affect everything. Their mood, their ability to work, their social interactions. The staff of life that built their society was simultaneously dismantling their bodies, bite by painful bite. Why was this trade-off accepted? Because there was no trade-off to be made. There was no alternative. It wasn't a choice. It was the price of agriculture itself, given their technology. The worldview that underpinned this was one of acceptance. The gods gave you grain, and the grain came with grit. Pain was a part of life. You endured it. You might make a magical incantation to the toothworm, a creature they believed gnawed at the teeth and caused decay, but you had no practical way to stop the relentless mechanical abrasion. This paradox lies at the very heart of the Neolithic Revolution. The shift to agriculture allowed for a massive population boom and the rise of cities, but in many ways, it was a disaster for individual human health. Early farmers were often shorter, more disease-ridden, and had worse teeth than their hunter-gatherer ancestors, whose diets were more varied and less abrasive. The Mesopotamians were living through the long, painful consequences of this momentous choice. Bread gave them civilization, but it took their teeth, and often their lives, in return. This constant, painful reality must have had a psychological effect. It might even explain some of the bewildering variety of breads we see in the record. If the fundamental experience of eating was often unpleasant, perhaps the endless variation in shape and form was a way of distracting from the painful substance. It was a way to exert some small measure of control and artistry over a food that was, at its core, an agent of pain. Maybe some of those 300 different breads weren't just for bureaucratic accounting, but were the result of bakers' desperate and ultimately failed experiments to create a better experience. This constant, painful reality must have had a psychological effect. It might even explain some of the bewildering variety of breads we see in the record. If the fundamental experience of eating was often unpleasant, perhaps the endless variation in shape and form was a way of distracting from the painful substance. It was a way to exert some small measure of control and artistry over a food that was, at its core, an agent of pain. Maybe some of those 300 different breads weren't just for bureaucratic accounting, but were the result of bakers' desperate and ultimately failed experiments to create a better experience. Let's return to those lexical lists, the cuneiform menus that boast hundreds of types of bread. Assyriologists have spent years cataloguing these terms, creating a picture of a rich and varied baking tradition. We see breads classified by their flour type: barley, emmer, wheat, their additions: onion, garlic, sesame, honey, date, their shape: crescent, heart, ring, braid, and their quality: good, fine, excellent. The glamorous illusion is one of a bustling, creative culinary scene. We imagine bakers as artists and innovators, constantly inventing new recipes, new techniques, new forms to delight the palates of their customers. It paints a picture of a civilization so advanced, so secure in its food supply, that it had the luxury to develop a complex and sophisticated patisserie. Now, let's apply a healthy dose of skepticism to this linguistic abundance. Let's look at this list not as a menu of delights, but as a record of failures, frustrations, and desperate experiments. The shocking reality is that many of these 300 kinds of bread were likely not established, delicious recipes, they were probably one-off experiments, failed batches, or even just descriptive names for loaves that went wrong. In a world without precise measurements, without standardized yeast, without temperature-controlled ovens, baking was an unpredictable science. The same baker, using the same ingredients, could produce a wildly different result from one day to the next. Imagine a baker trying to make a simple round loaf. But the dough is too wet. It slumps in the oven and comes out flat and wide. What do you call it? You can't just throw it out. It's still food. So the scribe, needing to account for it, gives it a name: flat bread. The next day, the baker's sourdough starter is a bit too active. The bread rises too much and cracks open on top. This becomes cracked bread. Another time, he leaves it in the tanner for a moment too long, and it comes out darker than usual. This is now dark bread or fire-touched bread. Many of the names on the lists could be interpreted this way. A bread with a hole might not be an intentional bagel-like creation, but a loaf where a large air bubble formed and collapsed. A twisted bread might not be a beautiful braid, but a loaf that warped as it baked. This isn't culinary creativity. It's culinary triage. It's the act of naming and categorizing the unpredictable, often disappointing, results of a primitive technology. You don't throw away your mistakes. You give them a name and find someone to eat them. Why would they bother to record all these variations so meticulously? The logic, again, is bureaucratic. The temple or palace granary issues a certain amount of flour to the baker. That flour must be accounted for. If the baker is supposed to produce 100 good round loaves, but instead produces 50 good ones, 20 flat ones, 20 cracked ones, and 10 burnt ones, the scribe can't just write 40 failed loaves. That would imply incompetence or waste. Instead, he uses the precise, descriptive terms from his list. The inventory balances. The baker has produced 100 loaves of officially recognized, named types of bread. The institution looks efficient and orderly on the clay tablet, even if the reality was a series of minor kitchen disasters. The list of 300 breads isn't a testament to their success. It's a testament to their incredible system for documenting and legitimizing failure. This also helps explain the spices and additions we discussed earlier. Imagine a batch of dough starting to smell a little sour, a little rancid. What do? You knead in a massive amount of garlic and cumin. Now it's not spoiled bread. It's a new, official category, savory garlic cumin bread. The addition of the spice is a rescue mission. And the new name is the cover story. It transforms a failure of preservation into a culinary invention. Thinking of it this way completely changes our perception of the Mesopotamian baker. He is not just a placid artist. He is a man under pressure, constantly battling his ingredients and his equipment. He is an improviser, a salvager, a master of making the best of a bad situation. His creativity is born not of leisure, but of necessity. So the next time you hear about the incredible variety of Mesopotamian bread, don't picture a Parisian bakery with endless choices. Picture a desperate, resourceful baker trying to make something edible out of sandy flour, a moody sourdough starter, and an unpredictable oven. Picture a meticulous scribe whose genius lies in making every outcome, good or bad, fit neatly into his ledger. The great list of breads is not a monument to their culinary triumphs, but a shadow history of their daily struggles. And in all these struggles, with all these variations, there was one constant, one flavor note that could never be eliminated, a flavor that has been lost to us forever. And in all these struggles, with all these variations, there was one constant, one flavor note that could never be eliminated, a flavor that has been lost to us forever. Today, there is a growing fascination with recreating the foods of the past. You can find them online, the dedicated historical foodies and experimental archaeologists, striving for perfect authenticity. Let's imagine one now. They have sourced rare emmer wheat, the same ancient grain cultivated in the Fertile Crescent. They have rejected commercial yeast, patiently cultivating their own sourdough starter from the wild yeasts in the air. They have even built a replica tanner oven in their backyard, learning its quirks, firing it with wood to avoid the aroma of dung. They grind their grain by hand between two stones. The final product is a masterpiece of historical reconstruction. It's a beautiful, rustic loaf, dense and fragrant, with a slightly sour tang from the wild fermentation and a smoky hint from the clay oven. They take a bite and declare, with pride, that this is it. This is the taste of ancient Mesopotamia. This is the bread that built Babylon. The glamorous illusion is that we, with enough research and dedication, can bridge the millennia. We can taste the past, connect with our ancestors, and share a meal with Gilgamesh. Now, you and I know better. We have journeyed through their world, and we can see the lie at the heart of that beautiful, authentic loaf. The shocking reality, the final, inescapable truth, is that no modern recreation will ever be truly authentic. Because there is one crucial ingredient that no baker today would ever, under any circumstances, add to their flour. No one would take a handful of sand from the garden, a spoonful of dust from the vacuum cleaner, and a pinch of fine gravel and carefully knead it into their dough. No one would deliberately seek out a soft sandstone quern specifically because it sheds more grit. To do so would be an act of culinary insanity. It would be creating a food that is not just unpleasant, but actively harmful. And so, the most authentic, most pervasive, most defining flavor of Mesopotamian bread is the one flavor that is forever lost to us. We can replicate the grain, the yeast, the shape, the oven, but we cannot and would not replicate the pain. The bread of the historical foodie is a fantasy. It's a modern loaf dressed in ancient costume. Its very edibility, its pleasant texture, its satisfying toothies are the things that make it a fraud. The real bread of Mesopotamia wasn't satisfying. It was a negotiation, a battle. Every bite was a risk. The soundtrack to their meal was not a happy crunch, but the sickening grate of enamel on stone. We can't recreate that because our entire food system, our entire worldview, is built on the promise of avoiding that sensation. Our flour is milled by steel rollers, sifted by microscopic screens, packaged in sealed bags and delivered to us in a state of impossible, blissful purity that would have seemed like divine magic to a Sumerian. The real forgotten flavor of Mesopotamia is not a rare herb or a lost spice. It is the taste of a world without choice. It is the flavor of necessity. It is the taste of a life where the very thing that keeps you alive is also, slowly and inexorably, grinding you down. Remember the woman at the quern, her body reshaped by her work. The grit was the taste of her suffering. Remember the king with his abscessed jaw. The grit was the taste of the limits of his power. Remember the laborer, paid in a wage that destroyed his mouth. The grit was the taste of his exploitation. Remember the dead, condemned to an eternity of eating dust. The grit was a foreshadowing of their grim fate. This flavor is lost to us because we have, by and large, been liberated from the world that produced it. We have the luxury of choice. We can demand food that is not just nourishing, but safe, clean, pleasant. The absence of grit in our bread is a silent, uncelebrated miracle of modernity. It's a luxury we are so accustomed to that we don't even recognize it as one. So, as we end our journey, we realize we can never truly taste their bread. We can analyze it, we can write about it, we can imagine it. But to taste it would require us to taste the totality of their existence, the backbreaking labor, the chronic pain, the ever-present dust, the smoke of the dung fire, the fear of spoilage, the resignation to a world where a soft loaf of bread was an impossible dream. The forgotten flavor isn't an ingredient. It's their reality. And it's a reality we can only, and perhaps thankfully, ever visit in our imaginations as we begin to drift and to dream. The sun has finally set over the fields of emmer wheat. The relentless heat of the day has bled away into the cool, dry air of the Mesopotamian night. The sounds of the village are fading. The rhythmic, grating scream of the quern stone has fallen silent. The communal oven, once glowing with a fierce heat, is now just a warm, dark shape, its ashes slowly turning cold. The world has softened into shades of grey and deep indigo under a vast, star-filled sky. The dust, which hung in the air all day, has settled, blanketing the quiet earth in a fine, soft powder. The stories have been told. The day's bread, in all its gritty reality, has been eaten. The final, weary thoughts of the day begin to dissolve into the gentle haze of approaching sleep. There is only the quiet now, a deep and ancient stillness that settles over the land between the two rivers. The struggles of the day are done. The pain in the jaw subsides into a dull, distant throb. All that is left is the soft whisper of the night wind, carrying with it the faintest scent of dry earth and straw, as the whole world sinks into a well-earned, if temporary, peace. Let the dust settle. Let the quiet enfold you. It is time to rest.